Okay, hello everybody. Um, you are in workshop 4A, beneath the trauma and toxic stress, the adaptation of the brain structure and function, with Renee Headed. She's LMSW, and she is the lead Agape director. I am Amy Dreyer. I work for the coalition as the associate director of programs. And I'm going to put some things in the chat so you will learn how to get certifications. You will learn how to give your um, a survey, an eval survey. You'll learn about our book table. You'll learn about muting. I'm sure Renee will have her own direction to give you, but feel free to drop things in the chat. I will be monitoring it. Otherwise, please enjoy.
Great. Thanks a lot, Amy.
You're welcome.
Thrilled to be here. I am a member of the team of the coalition. I've been the lead Agape director for the last 5 years. Most of my work is done in the central part of New York, so the Ithaca and surrounding community. So welcome. I see some of our families on the line, so I'm thrilled to have you today. So before we talk about this topic, know that, my disclaimer is I am not a neurobiologist by training. I am a parent by training, right? So for the last 25 years, I have been parenting children from adversity as a foster parent, now as an adoptive parent and a kinship parent. And over those 25 years, I've watched the science evolve through the experiences that we as parents and our children have, and we learn from our children. So as we go through some of this material today, I'm going to be using stories around my experiences with my children, because that's how I've learned and how I've grown and understood what happens to my children's brains as they've experienced adversity in their own childhoods. So with that said, it's not going to let me advance my slides. All right, we're going to start again and try again. I noticed that somebody else had the same issue yesterday. All right, let me try something different. There we go. Zoom is great. It's a little quirky though. All right, so in the next hour, we're really just going to focus on 3 things. One is, what is the adaptation of the child's brain structure and function due to trauma, toxic stress, and adversity? The second is, what does that look like in the behaviors and symptoms my child is exhibiting? And then we're going to relay those behaviors and symptoms back to the brain structure. And the third is, how can I help my child heal? Right? But that's an introduction. I don't have a lot of time today, but we will talk a little bit about some of the things. And also know that many of the things that we're going to talk about are going to mirror what you heard from Dr. Perry earlier today. Right? So hopefully this is also a refresher. So I always start by saying, as we talk about this over the next hour, choose one child to keep in your mind as you think this through, right? If you have one foster child or one adopted child or one child in your clinical setting or one child in your school setting, pick that one child rather than trying to apply this to a classroom worth of children or the last 10 foster kids you had. Pick one kid, right? And some of the behaviors that you see listed here are the kids that are in your homes, that are in your classrooms, and there's reasons and causations behind those behaviors. So I want you to just take a minute, think about that one kiddo. I'm going to probably focus on one of my many children that have been in my home, but you'll hear stories from other kids in my house as well. So we always start with that introduction of what is adverse childhood experiences. And Dr. Perry talked a little bit about that this morning in terms of what he called ACEs. So adverse childhood experiences or ACEs are experiences in childhood that create toxic stress. Toxic stress is a level of stress that creates an adaptation in the child's brain that leads to changes in how they respond to stress, behave, learn, attach, and have physical and mental health. Toxic stress, as he talked about earlier today, is strong, frequent, prolonged activation of the body's stress response system. And we're going to talk a lot about the stress response system today. But the key is, in absence of that buffering adult, right? All children experience adversity. All children have stress in their life. But what's the difference between it becoming toxic and changing the brain structure and function and it being protective, right, and resilient? And the real bottom line is that protective buffering adult. So just again, an overview of adverse childhood experiences. As most of you know, now 22 years ago, two researchers really looked at what early childhood experiences do people have that then correlate to long-term health, behavioral, and social outcomes. And what that research showed is there's basically 10, in terms of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, physical and emotional neglect, and then dysfunction, right? Mental illness in the family, incarceration in the family, domestic violence, substance use disorders in the family, and divorce. Those were those common core 10 things that can be linked to toxic stress, which then can be linked to changes in our brain's structure and function. But I always point out that there are other things beyond those 10 that can create toxic stress if there's not a buffering adult, right? So all of the kids that we're speaking about in this conference come into foster care and adoptive placement, right? That in itself is a traumatic response or toxic stress experience for kids, right? They've all lost a parent, right? Many of them have lost siblings. Most of them lose close friends as they move from foster home to foster home. Many of our kids have been institutionalized, whether they're foreign-born children who were in orphanages or in group and treatment centers here in the United States. That institutional setting can be a stress environment. Right? Victims of violence, threats of violence, global violence, hospitalization, and the list goes on. Prenatal stressors, Dr. Perry talked about that this morning. Bullying, institutional racism, all of those also contribute to toxicity for stress. Know that adverse childhood experiences are common. 61% of adults have at least one. Out of those 10 core, at least one is answered by 61% of the population. 1 in 6 children answered yes to 4 or more of those experiences. And why 4 and more is important is the research actually pointed to what we call a dose-response relationship. The greater the adversity, the more impact or response the body has. And what we actually found, or what they found, is once we approach that answer of 4 or more on the ACE questionnaire of 10, is when we see a significant impact on our kids' behavior, on our children's brain development, health, physical and mental health, right? And we know that for kids with 4 or more ACEs, they're 30 times more likely to have learning and behavioral difficulties. Not even 32%, 32 times more likely to have those challenges. And what we're going to talk about today is, why is that? What changes in their body and their mind that then creates the challenges that our kids then have to become resilient around? So the core to toxic stress is that it truly does change the trajectory of the healthy development of our children. So Harvard University Center on the Developing Child, led by Dr. Snowcock, is a leader along with Dr. Perry in this venue of expertise. And there's a great 2-minute video that we're going to try our best to show you before I jump into anything else. So Amy, do you want to give it a try, or do you want me to give it a try?
Go ahead and give it a try. If you can't, then I'll try.
Okay. Can people hear that?
I cannot.
Cannot. Okay, that was our worry, is that we were going to have trouble hearing it. So let me try one more other thing, and then we'll let Amy try.
Yell when you need me to give a whirl.
How about now? Can people hear it now?
You're good.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So, what I really want to talk about is what happens to our children who are experiencing toxic stress and how it changes that stress response system that you just learned about with Dr. Perry earlier today and what Harvard just introduced to you. So first, know that every one of us has a stress response system, right? We have to. It's what keeps us alive, right? Without a stress response system, we would not be able to monitor or respond to threats, right? So what you see on the screen, of course, is the bear, right? So I'm going to use that as our base to understand the stress response system. So, if you can imagine yourself walking through the woods, right, and you come upon a bear, and I know most of you are thinking that's not going to happen, right? Let me say to you, my older sister, we grew up in the middle of nowhere, literally, and that did happen to her, right? She came face to face with a bear. So when we come face to face with a bear, within milliseconds, our body goes into a stress response so that we can either fight the bear, flee the bear, or hopefully not freeze, right? We immediately go into response that will save our lives. And what happens is our body and our mind work together. So our mind tells our body to release stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. And our body tells our mind to activate the limbic system. When you looked at Dr. Perry's upside down brain, right, you should have seen the limbic system right there on that third level, right? That system is responsible for fight, flight, and freeze to get your body to respond. And what your mind does is it activates the cortisol, the adrenaline, it starts firing in the limbic system, the particular structure is called the amygdala, and it increases your heart rate, it increases your breath rate, it increases glucose, right? So that you get blood, oxygen, and energy to your muscles so that you can do something to survive, right? Your hands get sweaty, your palms get sweaty, right? Your body's jittery. We all know what that feeling is like, right? And for most of us, when that bear passes by, we can then decompress, slow our stress response system down, and come back to equilibrium or a calm state. What happens to our young children when they do not have the ability to come back to calm, right? They're always facing the bear, right? For those of you who've heard me speak, I always say they're living in the cave with the bear, right? They're constantly in a stress response system because they're in their survival mode, right? And that stress response system revs up and they're constantly in that state. When that stress response system is constantly on, that changes how the stress response system works in our children's bodies and minds, and it changes how the function and structure of the brain is created. So what does that specifically look like? So we're just going to look at a couple of structures. We're not going to go into a lot of detail, but I just want to at least point out a few things to people. So there's an adaptation to the brain when that stress response system is overactivated. And we're going to look at the midbrain.
Most people won't do this repair because of the complexity and cost.
Can everyone mute? Someone's unmuted. Please double check. I'm trying.
Thank you, whoever muted. Thank you. So we're going to look at the midbrain, or that limbic system, right? It literally is in the middle of your brain. That's midbrain, makes it simple, right? And there's two structures that are significantly impacted by toxic stress, cortisol, adrenaline, right? When the body's constantly under stress. What you're looking at in this picture is actually a brain from the side, like you're looking through a child's ear, right? And the light pink is the cortex and the cerebellum and the brainstem. But the dark red, of course, it's not these colors in your brain, but the dark red is trying to show you the middle of the brain, right, called the midbrain. And what you'll see, you should see something called the amygdala. It looks like a little tiny acorn, right? The amygdala is the threat center or the fear center or the alarm center of your brain, right? Its job is to monitor for that bear and react to allow you to survive, right? The other structure that you see right connected to that is called the hippocampus. It's like a little squirrely thing. So those are the two things that are most impacted. The amygdala, the alarm center, what we know for kids who have experienced toxic stress is that structure is larger and more active compared to a child who did not experience toxic stress. So there's studies that show if they place the size and the activity of an amygdala of a child from adoption and compare it to the amygdala size and activity of a healthy, typical, non-traumatized biochild, the adopted child's amygdala is larger and more active, right? Because that stress response system has created that hypersensitivity and that larger size. Because just like you pump iron to increase your muscle mass, right? The more you use your muscles, the bigger they get. Same with the amygdala. The more that child is using that threat center, that fear center, that alarm system, the bigger it's going to get, right? And the bigger it is and the more overactive it is, it puts our children in a hypersensitive mode, which is what Dr. Perry was talking about. The other structure that's in the midbrain that's also impacted is that hippocampus, right? Which is actually atrophied. It's actually smaller. That's responsible for emotional memory and going from short-term to long-term memory. So some of our kids have some of those working memory challenges, right? You ask them to do a task and 10 minutes later you come back and they haven't done the task, right? But the question is, do they actually have enough working memory for them to hear it, process it, remember it, and do it, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So those are the two things that are in the middle part of the brain that are impacted. Then in terms of the cortex, right, the thinking brain, the covering to the midbrain, right, where kids process things. there's also a change. And what I want you to see in these two pictures is on the left is a healthy brain. You are looking straight down on top of somebody's head, okay? At the top of the screen, you can see where two eyes would be. Okay? And then if you go where the two white circles are, that's the temples right here. And then the bottom of the screen is actually the back of the skull. And what these two images show is activity is represented by reds, yellows, greens, right? We want neural activity. And in a healthy brain, you can see that, the front of the brain is very, very active, right? And the sides of the brain are active. So where the circles are is the temporal lobe, all right? And in the very top, the very front, where you see all the red and where the eyes would be, that's directly behind your forehead, and that's called the prefrontal cortex. And you can see in a healthy child how active that is. But then the brain next to it is a 3-year-old who's experienced significant abuse and neglect. Okay. I can say to you, although this isn't actually my daughter's brain scan, this is what my daughter's brain looks like, right? And you can see much less red, much less yellow, and we actually have some inactivity, right? And this is created from that toxic stress, dysregulated stress response system that our kids experienced in early childhood. So what happens with the thinking brain or the cortex is the temporal lobes are atrophied, right? They're not very active. There's sections of them that are actually dark and black. And the temporal lobes are responsible for emotional regulation, right? They're responsible to integrate all those sensory inputs. Remember Dr. Perry was talking about, we get visual input, auditory input, olfactory input, and then our brain has to bring them all together. The temporal lobes is one piece of that system, that just one, there's many pieces of it. But the other thing that's atrophied and very quiet is right behind your forehead, right? That prefrontal cortex. And that's responsible for executive functions. Executive functions are things that executives do well with. They can plan, they can manage multiple tasks, they can initiate tasks, they can manage time, right? They can organize themselves. Those are executive functions that happen in that prefrontal cortex, right? Ability to make appropriate judgments, decision-making, problem-solving, mood regulation, and impulse control, right, are all a function of that prefrontal cortex, which, as you can see, a child who has a history of adversity and toxic stress, it's less active and atrophied, which then leads to the behaviors that you're seeing in your homes. So those are the major structural changes. There's others, but I'm just highlighting, we only have an hour. The other thing that I always want to point out is there's a change in the function of the brain, right? And two things that I think are really important as a foster and adoptive parent to understand are these 2 points. Cortisol is that long-lasting stress hormone, right? We have adrenaline and cortisol. And the cortisol is actually the hormone that's most detrimental to our kids. But what we find, what research has proven, kids who come from adversity and toxic stress, they have an elevated basal cortisol level compared to non-traumatized peers. So as I sit here as a non-traumatized person, right? For those of you who know me, I have the best parents on the planet, right? Very little to no trauma in my history. As I sit here, let's say my cortisol level's at 10. But my 21-year-old who comes to me with an ACE score of 8, right? So he said yes to 8 of those 10 things. As he sits next to me, his cortisol level is much higher. So his cortisol level might be at 50, might be at 80, while I'm sitting here at 10, okay? And we're gonna explain what that looks like in a second. The other thing that I think many of us forget, however, there is a smaller subset of our children who we actually see cortisol levels are less than, right? And I can say to you, again, here I sit with a cortisol level of 10. My 20-year-old is one of those minority children who falls in the reduced cortisol level. And her cortisol level might be a negative 10, right? And the next slide is going to explain what that looks like in your kids. The other thing that's important about our children that I hear so much about is, for me, who's a non-traumatized person, right? I can get stressed, right? I can see that bear coming into my view of eye, or I can see a deer jump out in front of my car, right? And I can immediately activate my stress response system. But then once the deer passes or the bear goes away, I can very quickly bring myself back to a calm state. But for our children, what they're finding is once they've escalated, right? Once they're in that major stress response system, it's much more difficult for them to turn that switch off and come back down to equilibrium. So this is what those two things look like in real life. So this chart was actually designed by my two teenagers who are now two young adults. And what you're looking at is the dotted blue line and the dotted red line is a child with no adversity, right? So that would be like me, right? The dark solid red line and blue line are my 21-year-old with an ACE score of 8. Okay? And then what you can't see is there's a line drawn across 0. So don't let me forget, I'll come back to the 0 line in a minute. So there was 2 incidences in my children's high school that illustrate the fact that they're either hypo or hypoactive, and they have a difficulty turning the switch off. So I'm going to explain one of them and then just illustrate the other one quickly. So we're going to stay with the blue lines, the blue dotted line and the blue solid line. And my son, we're going to call him Nick, was in typing class, right? Typing away, most important class in high school, right? Learning keyboarding. And all of a sudden he heard this loud bang, right? Now, if you look at the dotted line, right, that blue line, all of his classmates were startled, right? They all had a stress response to that loud noise, and they all kind of went, oh, right? Took a deep breath, got themselves, stressed, but then very quickly were able to discern what was happening, calm themselves back down, and within less than a minute, they were back to typing. Okay? My son, right? So my son already started at a higher level, right? The stress response is on the vertical and the time is across the horizontal. So you can see his cortisol or stress response arousal, he was already escalated before the loud noise, right? Compared to his peers. His peers were at 10, he was at 30, right? So he's already escalated. So he doesn't have far to go, right? Because what do we hear from our parents all the time? My child goes from 0 to 100 in a split second. They're not going from 0, right? He's going from 30. There are days when he's going from 80, right? He's already elevated. So he's already elevated. He hears this loud noise and he skyrockets, right? He didn't do that. He literally jumped up on top of the typing table, right? Had this major response to this noise. And while his classmates decompressed, got themselves grounded, went back to typing, my son then jumped on to the filing cabinet, right? And what he was describing to me, he said, my heart was racing, my palms were sweating, my entire body was twitching, I couldn't control myself, right? And then he said, when he got his wits about him, this is by the time he got to the filing cabinet, he was going to tackle the gunman, right, from that loud noise when he came into the room, right? know that the sound was the dropping of a bowling ball in the physics lab above the typing class, right? But to him, and you saw it with Dr. Perry, right? The backfiring of the car this morning that he talked about, same thing with my son. He heard that loud noise, immediately his lower brain immediately attached it to gunshot, right? And that's where he was. So, immediately responded, and then he stays up there so much longer. So I asked him, how long before you went back to typing? He never went back to typing, right? I said, okay, how long before you could return to a class? 2 class periods, right? 80 minutes for him to bring himself back down to his baseline compared to his classmates, which was a minute or 2, right? Because again, his system has been overly taxed for so long that it doesn't know how to regulate or bring itself back down. Okay. So remember I said I'm going to go back to the line at 0 that you can't see. So let's take the next scenario. The next scenario was a bomb threat, right? So, everybody was stressed by that, right? That's terrifying. But if you look at the red solid line, that's the bomb threat. That's my son, Nick. It was 48 hours before he could calm his body. He literally was jumping out of his skin at my house for 48 hours, could not return to school, right? But on the 0 axis, right, the line you can't see, my daughter, who has the underactive cortisol basal level, right, had no response at all. None, right? Didn't get up out of her chair, didn't worry about it. She's like, what's everybody concerned about, right? Which is, to me, as the parent, scarier, right? Because if there really was a bomb, she wouldn't have left and she would have gotten blown up, right? Where my son was out of that school within seconds and in the parking lot, right? So you can see how this illustrates the fact that they either have a higher level of basal cortisol at rest or a lower one, and their thermostat doesn't work, right? They can't turn it on and off like you and I can turn it on. And my guess is you're seeing that in your homes. You're seeing that in your classrooms. You're seeing that in the therapy session. I'm just watching the time. So the other thing I always want to point out is there is also differences in how the neurotransmitters are released and uptaked. So neurotransmitters literally are the chemicals that allow your nerve cells to talk to one another. And what we now know is the neurotransmitters responsible for a sense of accomplishment and regulation of mood are decreased in our kids, right? So, I don't know about you, but my son, Nick, is the moodiest child I have ever met, right? Because he doesn't have the neurotransmitters to help him regulate that, right? We also know that there's other neurotransmitters that are in their system too much that increases anxiety, arousal, and aggression. And then lastly, I always find this fascinating, right? The other thing that's really interesting is there's a decrease in the production of dopamine, right? That's the feel-good drug. Everybody needs dopamine to feel good about who they are in their lives, right? Not only do they produce less, but the nerve cells are less sensitive to them. Thus, they need more. And how do you get dopamine? You do risky things, right? So when you look at your child who's doing incredibly risky things, right? I have a daughter who was doing very risky behaviors as a teenager, right? I finally sat her down and I said, okay, help me understand, what does it feel like in your body and your mind when you participate in these things? And probably the hardest moment of my 25 years as a parent was to hear her say to me, it's the only time that I feel normal, right? Because her body and her mind craved that. Now, luckily, I could say to her, okay, what other activities do you participate in that you get that same feeling that are safe? And luckily, she said participating in drama. So, you know, weirdly enough, the next day was tryouts for the high school play. She tried out, she made it, and I saw a huge difference, right? Because she was getting the dopamine she needed through an avenue that was safe rather than risky. We're gonna skip that because I'm watching the clock. So, you know, the changes in the function and the structure of a child's brain because of toxic stress then looks like to us these types of behaviors, right? I think all of us have kids who experience these behaviors, right? And as Dr. Perry stated, and I restated, right, our kids easily go into fight, flight, and freeze responses, right? Because that amygdala is overactive, the stress response system is overactive, it's hypersensitive, right? So a lot of the behaviors that we see, you have to ask yourself, is this a fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. You know, our kids are very hypersensitive to stress, right? That amygdala is bigger and overactive, and they have cortisol in their system. So they're constantly monitoring the environment to say, am I safe, right? And then if anything at all, whether it's a smell, a sound, a tone of voice, a request, anything can trigger them into a very quick stress response, right? Into fight, flight, and freeze. Their fear center is hyperactive, right? The amygdala, the stress response system is constantly on, right? And what I think is important for adoptive and foster parents to know and teachers to know is even when I take the child out of the cave with the bear and put them in the comfort with a kitty cat, right? The brain still is fearful. The brain still considers itself in the cave with the bear, right? So even though we may feel that this is a safe environment for the child, that doesn't mean that the child feels safe. Okay? We're going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes. Impulsive behavior, right? Whenever I meet with adoptive parents and ask in a group, how many of your kids have impulsive behaviors? 100% of the parents raise their hands, right? And we now know, right? Think about that prefrontal cortex that wasn't orange and wasn't red, right? Wasn't yellow, is responsible for impulse control. In those kids, that part of the brain's atrophy. Aggressive behaviors, right? Again, inability to regulate, inability for emotional control, and then we know they have more chemicals, neurotransmitters in their brain that creates aggression, right? So we do quite often see more aggressive behaviors in our kids. However, what I would say to you, and particularly to teachers, is I have very rarely, if ever, seen a proactively aggressive child. It is almost inevitably a reactive aggressive child. They are triggered by something, whether it's the child next to them looked at them funny, or they can't have that particular snack that they wanted today, or they have a flashback because the bowling ball hit the ground and made a loud noise. They react and are triggered, and that trigger creates the aggressive behavior. Right? So it's not about the aggressive behavior, it's about what created the reaction, right? When we talk about our kids. Our kids need to feel control, because imagine their brain feels chaotic, right? So they're going to control their environment. They're going to be defensive so that they can protect themselves, right? Self-protection, right? They're in that fear state. They're in that alarm system state. So they have to control and protect themselves from others. Right? We already talked about it takes much longer to calm this child because, again, that thermostat of stress response doesn't necessarily work very well for our kids. The exaggerated behavioral response, right? We certainly understand that. And then we've got a lot of kids that withdraw and they go into that freeze state, or those are the kids who have the lower cortisol basal level than we want them to have. So those are some of the behaviors that my guess is you are seeing in your homes, in your clinics, and in your classrooms. Other things that we see with our kids with physical and mental health, they're at much higher risk for depression and anxiety. As a matter of fact, if your child has an ACE score of 4 or more, they now know that they're almost 6 times as likely to have depression and anxiety, and they're 12 times more likely to make a suicide attempt. And if you think about what their brain looks like, go back to those slides earlier, that should now make sense to you of why that is. The same with emotional numbing, right? Because the brain chemistry and structure is different. A lot of our kids have significant shame. They have difficulty trusting, right? Block trust. A lot of our kids self-harm. And it's interesting when you talk to a self-harmed child, it's really back to what I was describing with my risky behavior child. They're seeking that chemicals response they need in the brain. And one way they can get that is through self-harm. A lot of our kids have body image issues, risky behaviors. We just talked about that, decreased self-worth. Not only do we know that socially why that is, right? But biochemically, we now know, right? They have less of that neurotransmitter that allows you to feel accomplished. So in addition to, abandonment and rejection and all of those common core issues of adoption and foster care, add the neurobiology of inability, less neurotransmitter for accomplishment. And then many of our kids, have medical challenges that are linked, and we're not talking about it today, but there are links between toxic stress and significant health issues. But a lot of our kids, sleep difficulties. I can say to you, my 21-year-old is still, he's been with us 4 years now, still is waking up with horrifying nightmares, still has stomach issues, still has headache issues. And they're all related to the change that toxic stress has created in the child's body and mind. Academically, beyond the behavioral and social emotional challenges that our kids go into classrooms with, add some of these academic challenges as well. Remember that hippocampus is atrophied, right? So there's that impaired working memory. I can say to my younger son, who was labeled, stupid, lazy, not trying, distracted, inattentive, right? All those things you probably heard about your kids. When we finally got to it, when he was old enough, he was about in 3rd grade, he said, "Mom, I hear the teacher." And I'm like, "Yep, I can do that." And then by the time I put my head down to work on my paper, he says, "I have no idea what the teacher told me to do." Right? Because that impaired memory, that working memory is not there for him, right? He's the same kid who I can give him a 1-step direction and come back 10 more minutes later and he's like, what did you ask me to do, right? And he hasn't done any of it, right? But easily fixed, right? So when we finally figured that out, the teacher would just put a sticky note on his desk with the written instructions after she gave him the verbal instructions. And that simple of an accommodation, he was no longer inattentive. He was no longer lazy. He was no longer stupid, right? That was all it took, right? It's figuring those little things out. A lot of our kids have sensory processing challenges. Again, Dr. Perry went over a little of this. I'm not going to go in depth, but I can say to you, in the general population, 2 out of 10 adults have sensory processing challenges. In children of trauma, it is 8 out of 10. So if your child does not have sensory challenges, they are the exception to the rule, right? So you have to think about what sensory challenges does my child have and how do I accommodate and, treat that sensory processing challenge. I would say, 99% of you will say to me, my child has difficulty with focus and attention, right? And there's many reasons why that is, right? The prefrontal cortex is a piece of it because they have difficulty attending, right? Because that's a function of the prefrontal cortex. But also remember, these kids' monitoring system, fear system, amygdala, limbic system, right, is constantly scanning the environment, right? And I'll never forget, I had a 7-year-old foster child who, was not going to get on to second grade, right? He was so far behind. And once he was kind of settled in our home and really comfortable and feeling safe and doing well and starting to heal, he said to me, he said, I can't pay attention to the teacher because I've got to look through my classroom all the time to make sure nobody's going to come in and hurt me, right? So the question is, why is the child having attentional difficulties, right? The core reason. Perfectionism, a lot of our kids need to be perfect. And then we've already talked about executive function difficulties. Right? So all of these interplay for your child. What I'm asking people to do is to look at your child's behavior as symptoms of the changes in their body and their mind. And link those changes back to what you're learning in terms of what is different in my child's brain structure and my child's brain function, right? So I want you to look underneath the behavior and find the causation of the behavior, right? Because the only way we're going to help our kids heal is by treating the reason for the behavior, not the behavior, right? So I always like the way Dr. Burke Harris talks about it, right? She said, when you walk into my pediatrics office and your child has a cough, I could easily give your child cough medicine and stop the cough. But your child will continue to have pneumonia, right? I'm not getting rid of the cause. And when I'm not getting rid of the cause of pneumonia, his cough will persist forever. I'm asking you to do the same thing for your child's behavior. Consider the behavior, right? Figure out what the behavior is a symptom of. Is it pneumonia, right? But in our case, is it trauma, right? And find what's causing the behavior. And our job as a parent, a clinician, a teacher, is to treat the causation of the behavior, the pneumonia, not the behavior or the cough, right? That is trauma responsive care, treating the causation of a child's behavior, not behavior. So how do we do that? And I know I only have a couple more minutes. So I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of what research is showing in terms of how do we heal our child's brain and body. So when our child's brains and body are healed from trauma, the behaviors will change, right? Versus me trying to change the behavior. What I'm going to try to change is the brain structure and function. And the way that we do that are a few things. First and foremost, a child must feel safe and be stable, right? Because remember, their brain is still living in the cave with the bear. Our job is to help them feel safe so that fear center, that monitoring center, that amygdala, that limbic system can calm down, right? I want to reduce cortisol, reduce adrenaline, decrease the firing of the amygdala. And the only way to do that is to help the child feel safe. I caution people, though, to say it's not about us feeling that we're providing a safe environment for the child. It's about the child feeling safe in our environment. So I always give this example. I'm going to stick with Nick, right? Nick came to me at 17 years old after being left homeless and after 17 years of abuse and neglect. And I felt we had a safe environment, we have a great house, lovely neighborhood, great siblings, right? And he and I were in the kitchen one night. I was teaching him how to make spaghetti because every kid's got to know how to do that before they live on their own, right? And he literally is jumping around the kitchen. I mean, he just could not keep his body still. And I said, okay, help me understand what you're feeling right now. Your body's jumping all around, what's going on? And he described his body, right? He can't keep still, his heart is racing, he can't catch his breath, his palms are sweaty, right? All the stress response is that we would have, right? He was describing. I said, well, help me understand why you're feeling that way. And remember, keep on this vein of he's terrified that somebody's going to come shoot him. Okay. So we have a door in the back of the kitchen that looks out onto the backyard that's completely glass. The entire door is glass. So I can look out, make dinner, watch my kids play in the backyard. And he said to me, when it gets dark and I'm in the kitchen or I come out in the middle of the night because I've had a nightmare and I want to get a snack, he said, I'm terrified somebody's going to come through the backyard and shoot me through that door, right? So he did not feel safe in that kitchen. So, you know, my knee-jerk reaction would have been, oh, well, I'll just leave the floodlight on in the backyard and then you could see, right? I didn't do that, right? What I did instead, I said, well, help me understand what would help you feel safe in the kitchen. And his response is, I need a curtain put up on that window so that I can't see out the window. Now to me, I'm like, well, then you can't see anybody coming at you, right? But for him, he needed the curtain to feel safe. So he and I drove to Joann Fabrics. We bought a couple of yards of fabric. I taught him how to sew. He made the curtain and we put the curtain up and he completely calmed his body and his mind in the kitchen. But that was him feeling safe, not me assuming he was feeling safe. Right? So felt safety is key because you can't heal a child's brain and body if you can't get the stress response system to calm itself. The other thing that we know is, and Dr. Perry said it earlier, the number one thing that changes a child's brain and body and helps them be resilient is a respectful, trusting relationship with another stable and long-term adult. And that's us, right? That's the adoptive mom, that's the foster dad, right? That's the grandma who's taking care of their grandchildren, right? That's who we are, right? To have that connection to the child. And then the last thing is what I love Dr. Perry the majority of us talk about is co-regulation, right? These children don't have the skills for self-regulation, right? And that's a workshop all onto its own. So we're not going to get into why that is, but they need you as the adult to co-regulate them, right? So the last things I just want to mention is, you know, research is showing these are the keys to help a child's mind and body heal. And beyond the three we just talked about. And play is at the very top of the list, right? Kids need to play. And a lot of our kids come to us not having a history of play, right? I can say to you, my two daughters who grew up in an orphanage did not have a toy, did not have a book, did not have any opportunity for interaction or playfulness, right? Or, you know, my oldest son, Nick, who came to me, his life was to survive. He certainly did not have time to go ride a bike, right? Or play water balloons or whatever, right? And the funnest thing, and when he came here, he's been with us 4 years, the best time I always see him is he's out, I kid you not, riding a tricycle at 18, right? Because he needs to play, he needs to be silly, he needs to be fun. That's the way the body calms itself and engages in healthful recovery from trauma. Our kids need to sleep, right? And we know that a lot of our kids have issues with sleep because it's scary, right? They need to move their bodies, right? The way that you dissipate cortisol and adrenaline and the way that you increase the positive neurotransmitters you need, the way you get glucose out of your body is you move it, right? So it's so funny in my neighborhood, right? There's myself and 5 children, and my neighbors see us walking as a troop through the town, right? There's a reason that every day we take a walk together, right? Or when my house gets really escalated with 5 kids, we pile in the car and we go to the local nature center and we take a hike, right? But exercise is important. Engaging them in meaningful learning, right? The way you develop that prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobes is you engage it, right? Get them thinking, get them problem solving, get them learning, right? I can say to you, when my daughter is out of school, her bored mind, her inactive mind regresses, right? She needs to have that learning. The other thing I thought was really interesting about what Dr. Perry was saying in terms of managed stress. All of us are going to have stress. And actually, we need stress to grow and to, improve our lives, right? And we need to. So, 25 years ago, the training was, don't let these kids have any stress, right? Now we know our job as the parent, the clinician, the teacher, is to get it manageable, right? With a buffering adult, right? And Dr. Perry went into that, so I'm not going to do a lot on that. Mindfulness, we know that works. Related to that on the next list, meditation. It's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And we know, right? Meditation will heal the brain and actually change the structure of the brain. Healthy relationships, good nutrition, mental health services. And again, the number one thing is being the safe, stable, nurturing relationship that child needs to be that connection, to be that security for that child. That's what adoption and foster care is all about.